Imagine standing on the deck of a ship, looking down into crystal blue waters. Below you, in the darkness, lie more than 50 warships, cruisers, destroyers, battleships, American, Japanese, Australian, all entombed together in the same stretch of ocean. This is Iron Bottom Sound. Before World War II, it was simply called Savo Sound, a tranquil passage between the tropical islands of Guadalcanal, Savo, and Florida in the Solomon Islands. But between August 1942 and February 1943, this peaceful channel became the stage for some of the most savage naval combat in history. So many ships sank here that Allied sailors gave it a name that would echo through naval history forever. Iron Bottom Sound. More than 53 vessels rest on the seafloor here. Over 20,000 men lost their lives in these waters, and the battles fought here would determine the fate of the entire Pacific War. This is the story of the Ghost Fleet, the ships, the sailors, and the 6 months of hell that turned a tropical paradise into the largest naval graveyard of World War II. To understand why Iron Bottom Sound matters, you need to understand what was at stake in August 1942. 6 months earlier, Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. In the months that followed, the Japanese military swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. The Philippines, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, all conquered. By mid-1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific. The Rising Sun flag flew over millions of square miles. But America was beginning to strike back. In June 1942, U.S. forces won a crucial victory at the Battle of Midway, sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and shifting the balance of naval power in the Pacific. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Americans were ready to go on the offensive. The target, Guadalcanal. This remote island in the Solomon chain seemed insignificant. Covered in jungle, infested with disease, barely inhabited. But Japanese forces had landed there and begun constructing an airfield. If completed, that airfield would allow Japanese bombers to cut the vital supply lines between America and Australia. The entire Allied position in the South Pacific would collapse. The airfield had to be taken. And so, on August 7, 1942, 11,000 U.S. Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal in America's first major offensive operation of the war. They quickly overran the Japanese construction crews and captured the unfinished airstrip, renaming it Henderson Field. But taking the island was the easy part. Holding it would require fighting through 6 months of hell. On land, in the air, and most brutally, at sea in the waters that would become Iron Bottom Sound. The Japanese response was immediate and devastating. Just 2 days after the Marines landed, a powerful Japanese naval force raced south through the channel known as the Slot, the passage through the Solomon Islands. Their objective? Destroy the Allied ships protecting the vulnerable transports and supply vessels off Guadalcanal. The Allied forces were ready, or so they thought. A screen of cruisers and destroyers patrolled the waters between Savo Island and Guadalcanal. 4 heavy cruisers formed the backbone of the defense. The American cruisers Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes, along with the Australian cruiser Canberra. They never stood a chance. Just after midnight on August 9th, the Japanese strike force attacked. They had trained extensively for night combat, something the Allies had not. Using superior optics and tactics, the Japanese achieved complete surprise. Within 30 minutes, all 4 Allied cruisers were burning wrecks. The Canberra took 24 direct hits and was dead in the water. The Astoria absorbed at least 65 shells and was set ablaze from bow to stern. The Quincy attempted to charge the Japanese line, but was hit by at least 70 shells and 2 torpedoes. The Vincennes took 85 shells and a torpedo, breaking in half as she sank. Over 1,000 Allied sailors died that night. The commanding officers of both Canberra and Quincy were killed in action. Another 700 men were wounded. The Japanese lost virtually nothing, just 30 men killed across their entire force. The Battle of Savo Island stands as one of the worst defeats in U.S. Navy history. The Japanese had achieved a stunning victory, but they made a crucial mistake. Instead of pressing on to destroy the defenseless transport ships filled with supplies for the Marines, the Japanese commander withdrew. He feared American aircraft carriers might be nearby. They weren't. The transports survived. But the Marines on Guadalcanal were now dangerously exposed, clinging to a tiny beachhead with limited supplies and no heavy naval support. 4 major warships rested on the bottom of what was now becoming Iron Bottom Sound. And this was only the beginning. With Henderson Field in American hands, the Japanese faced a serious problem. How do you reinforce and resupply your troops on Guadalcanal when enemy aircraft control the skies during daylight? The answer: you don't travel during the day. You travel at night. Thus was born one of the most famous and desperate operations of the Pacific War. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. The Japanese called it rat transportation, because like rats, they moved under cover of darkness. Fast destroyers would race down the slot at high speed, arriving off Guadalcanal after dark. They'd quickly unload troops and supplies, then race back up the slot before dawn, hoping to escape the range of Henderson Field's aircraft before sunrise. Sometimes they'd bombard the Marine positions or Henderson Field itself, then disappear into the night. It was dangerous work. Destroyers weren't designed to carry supplies, their cargo capacity was minimal, and they burned fuel at an alarming rate. But it was the only way the Japanese could support their forces without suffering devastating losses to American air power during daylight. For months, this became the pattern. By day, American aircraft from Henderson Field ruled the skies. By night, the Tokyo Express ruled the seas. And in the waters between, Iron Bottom Sound grew more crowded with wrecks. The Americans tried to intercept these high-speed runs with their own surface forces. Sometimes they succeeded. Often they didn't. The Japanese had superior night-fighting equipment and training. Their Type 93 long-lance torpedoes were faster, longer-ranged, and more powerful than anything the U.S. Navy possessed. In the confined dark waters around Guadalcanal, these advantages proved deadly. Ship after ship joined the Ghost Fleet on the bottom. PT boats were rammed by destroyers. Destroyers were torpedoed by other destroyers. Every night was a roll of the dice, and the house often won. By November 1942, the battle for Guadalcanal had reached a critical point. The Japanese were planning a massive offensive to recapture Henderson Field and drive the Americans off the island. To support this attack, they assembled a powerful bombardment force centered around 2 fast battleships, the Hiei and her sister ship Kirishima. The plan was simple. Race down the slot under cover of darkness, shell Henderson Field into oblivion with 14-inch battleship guns, then withdraw before dawn. With the airfield destroyed, Japanese transports could land during daylight, bringing thousands of reinforcements. The Americans knew something big was coming. On the night of November 12th, going into the 13th, Friday the 13th, U.S. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan positioned his force to intercept. He had 13 ships, 5 cruisers, and 8 destroyers. Against him, the Japanese had 2 battleships, 1 light cruiser, and 11 destroyers. What followed was absolute chaos. The battle began just after 1:30 in the morning. At close range, in complete darkness, the 2 forces collided in a confused melee. Ships fired at targets they could barely see. Friend fired on friend. The light cruiser Atlanta was hit by friendly fire from another American ship, then pummeled by Japanese destroyers. Her admiral was killed, her captain mortally wounded. The destroyer La Fay got so close to the battleship Hiei that she couldn't depress her guns low enough to fire, so she raked Hiei's superstructure with machine gun fire before being blown apart. The destroyers, Cushing, Barton, and Monson, were all destroyed. The cruiser Juno was torpedoed and badly damaged. Admiral Callahan was killed when a Japanese shell struck his flagship, but his sacrifice accomplished the mission. The American destroyers and cruisers pressed so close, fighting so desperately, that the Japanese were forced to break off the bombardment. The battleship Hiei had been hit over 80 times. Though none of the shells penetrated her armor, they destroyed her steering gear and jammed her rudder. As dawn broke, Hiei was still wallowing near Guadalcanal, unable to maneuver. Then came the aircraft from Henderson Field. Wave after wave attacked the crippled battleship. Finally, overwhelmed by damage and flooding, Hiei sank, the first Japanese battleship lost in World War II. But the price was staggering. The Americans lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers that night. Over 1,400 American sailors died, and the worst was yet to come. As the survivors limped away from Guadalcanal on the morning of November 13th, the damaged cruiser Juno struggled to keep up. Her hull had been torn open by a torpedo during the night battle. She was taking on water, moving slowly, vulnerable. Around 11 in the morning, a Japanese submarine, I-26, spotted the American formation. The sub fired a spread of torpedoes at the cruiser San Francisco. They missed, but one torpedo continued on and struck Juno. The explosion was catastrophic. Juno's forward magazine detonated. The entire ship simply disintegrated in a massive blast. Within seconds, she was gone. Of the nearly 700 men aboard, only 10 would survive. Among the dead were 5 brothers from Waterloo, Iowa. George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert Sullivan had enlisted together after Pearl Harbor, demanding to serve on the same ship. The Navy had agreed. Now all 5 were gone, killed together when Juno exploded. When their parents received the news several weeks later, 5 telegrams arriving at the same house, it shocked the entire nation. The Sullivan brothers became symbols of both the sacrifice and the terrible cost of war. Their story would eventually inspire the policy of separating family members in combat, and would later influence the film Saving Private Ryan. Juno's loss added another name to the growing roll of ships in Iron Bottom Sound. But there were more battles to come. The Japanese weren't finished. On the night of November 14th, going into the 15th, they tried again. This time, the bombardment force was led by the battleship Kirishima, sister ship to the lost Hiei. She was escorted by 4 destroyers and came loaded with over 900 high-explosive shells intended for Henderson Field. Opposing them were 2 American battleships, USS Washington and USS South Dakota, accompanied by 4 destroyers. Unlike the chaotic brawl 2 nights before, this would be a classic battleship duel, the first between American and Japanese battleships in World War II. Initially, things went badly for the Americans. South Dakota suffered electrical failures that knocked out her radar and fire control systems. Blinded and vulnerable, she was hit by over 40 shells from Japanese ships. She was forced to break off, badly damaged, but still afloat. That left Washington. Under the command of Rear Admiral Willis Lee, Washington had hung back, hidden in the darkness. Her radar was working perfectly. She had Kirishima on her scopes, and Kirishima had no idea Washington was there. At just under 8,000 yards, point-blank range for battleships, Washington opened fire. Her 16-inch guns smashed into Kirishima with devastating effect. 9 heavy shells struck the Japanese battleship in just 7 minutes. Kirishima's steering was destroyed, her rudder jammed, fires raging throughout the ship. Washington also destroyed the destroyer Ayanami, which exploded and sank rapidly. The rest of the Japanese force fled. By dawn, the mortally wounded Kirishima was wallowing helplessly. Unable to save her, Japanese destroyers torpedoed their own battleship. She sank, joining her sister Hiei on the bottom of Iron-Bottom Sound. The Americans lost the destroyers Preston and Walk that night, with another destroyer, Benham, so badly damaged she had to be scuttled. But the mission was accomplished. Henderson Field was saved. The Japanese offensive had failed, but the Tokyo Express continued. On November 30th, a force of 8 Japanese destroyers raced down the slot on a supply run. They were intercepted by 5 American cruisers and 4 destroyers in what became known as the Battle of Tassafaronga. The Americans had superior numbers and firepower. They should have won easily. They didn't. Once again, Japanese superior night fighting skills and the deadly long-lance torpedoes turned the tide. The heavy cruiser Northampton was hit by 2 torpedoes and sank, adding another ship to Iron-Bottom Sound. 3 other American cruisers were torpedoed and badly damaged, though they survived. The Japanese lost just 1 destroyer. Rear Admiral Samuel Cox, director of the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command, would later call Tassafaronga one of the worst defeats in U.S. Navy history, second only to Pearl Harbor and Savo Island. By December 1942, the Japanese were losing the campaign. They couldn't supply their troops adequately. Disease, starvation, and constant American attacks were destroying their forces on Guadalcanal. The Tokyo Express continued into January and February of 1943, but the runs became less frequent, more desperate. On February 9, 1943, the Japanese finally evacuated their remaining troops from Guadalcanal. Over the course of 6 months, they had lost 24,000 men killed, most from starvation and disease. The Americans had suffered 7,000 casualties, but they held the island. The campaign had cost both navies dearly. In Iron-Bottom Sound and the surrounding waters rested over 50 Allied and Japanese warships. 20,000 sailors had died. It was the largest concentration of sunken warships anywhere in the world. Today, Iron-Bottom Sound is considered sacred by the U.S. Navy. Ships passing through are required to maintain strict silence in honor of those who died there. Every year on the battle's anniversary, U.S. warships cruise into these waters and drop wreaths to commemorate the fallen. The wrecks themselves remain largely undisturbed. Some lie in depths exceeding 800 meters. Others are shallow enough for divers to explore, though many are designated war graves and are protected by law. Expeditions led by explorers like Robert Ballard have documented some of the wrecks, revealing the violence of their final moments. Ships torn apart by torpedoes, gun turrets blown off, hulls twisted and broken. The ghost fleet of Iron-Bottom Sound tells a story of courage and sacrifice, of young men from Iowa enlisting together and dying together, of admirals sailing into battles they knew they might not survive, of sailors fighting in darkness against an enemy they couldn't see, with equipment that wasn't good enough, because turning back wasn't an option. The Battle of Guadalcanal was the turning point of the Pacific War. Before Guadalcanal, the Japanese were advancing. After Guadalcanal, they were retreating. Every major offensive that followed, the island-hopping campaign, the liberation of the Philippines, the eventual victory over Japan, was made possible because of what happened in those waters. 53 ships still rest in Iron-Bottom Sound. Each one has a story. Each one represents hundreds of lives lost. Together, they form the largest naval graveyard of World War II, a ghost fleet that changed the course of history. This is Iron-Bottom Sound. This is where the tide turned.